Republicans are coming for your voting rights in Maine and around the country. Maine Secretary of State Shenna Bellows is here to discuss. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Mark Elias. Let's get started. Shenna Bellows, welcome to Defending Democracy.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. So I got a lot of questions for you. I wanted to have you on because of one of the biggest threats to democracy that I think is going on right now that is not getting attention. You actually gave a press conference about it. So I was really struck by it. And I thought, what an absolutely great opportunity to have you on. For people who have not been following this story, as I understand it, but you should correct me if I'm wrong, the Department of Justice has been reaching out to secretaries of state around the country, or election officials, election offices around the country, seeking access to their voter rolls, the voter files, the kind of lists of all the people in the state who are registered, what their information is about, in states that have partisan registration, it would include that. It would include presumably what elections they voted in, not who they voted for, but what elections they voted in, whatever it is, that this is going on, which from my standpoint is completely inappropriate from the Department of Justice, because the Department of Justice doesn't administer elections in this country. States do, and your office does in Maine. So what light can you shed on that, and tell everyone, maybe start with, what was your response to them?
So I'll start with saying it's just important to folks to know that the Department of Justice wants your voter information. And when I say yours, I mean every American's voter information. It was the week of July 4th, and the criminal division of the Department of Justice reached out to my office to say, you may have received a letter from the civil division. We'd like to have a conversation about information sharing. So we were quite startled. We acknowledged receipt. We did not go to the next step. Fast forward a couple of weeks, in Washington, DOJ is trying to change the subject away from the Epstein files, right? That Bondi has pledged her loyalty to Trump. And suddenly the letter finally shows up, and it is shocking in how extensive it is. And so not only are they asking questions about how we maintain the voter rolls, election integrity, they want the personal information of every local election official in the state. And they ask for an electronic copy. They specify XLS, TXT, CVS. They want an electronic file uploaded to their system with the sensitive personal information of every voter in the state. And the National Association of Secretaries of State is meeting right now. They do a great job gathering information. DOJ told them that they intend to ask every state. So my response, and I'll be brief and then we can talk more about this, was go jump in the Gulf of Maine.
Well, good for you. And I wish every Secretary of State would take your lead on that. Do you have a sense, because I want to get into the details, but just at a top level, do you have a sense of whether other Secretaries of State are telling them that, or is it a mixed bag, or do you have just no idea how each state is handling it?
So the states do have a lot of conversations, and I think there are sort of three schools of thought, right? There are the states run by MAGA folks who are enthusiastic to do Trump's bidding and excited to sign up for whatever the latest is. Although I always want to ask them, what would you do if it was President Biden asking for your voter file, right? So that's one school of thought. Then there are the other secretaries who are standing up, and I'm really proud of Secretary Simon of Minnesota. He's a Democrat. He issued a statement that was basically like, Secretary Dave Scanlon, my neighbor in New Hampshire, Republican secretary, also told the DOJ they were not entitled to this information. Now, for the democracy geeks among your listeners, and I know many of them are,
you're in the right place.
So they are NVRA exempt, right? So the civil service letter to me was under the National Voter Registration Act, in the authority that DOJ has to enforce what traditionally was the ensuring that the states were doing enough to register voters, right? But Minnesota and New Hampshire are exempt. So their letters were under the Help America Vote Act, where really the DOJ has no authority. So, and then the state of Wisconsin, where the secretary is not in charge of elections, but they also denied the Justice Department's request.
Although that was kind of hilarious, right? Because I don't want to skip over this. The Secretary of State of Wisconsin literally has nothing to do with elections.
That's true.
I mean, like it's just like the, you know, it is. There are a handful of states. North Carolina is one of these states. Wisconsin, one of these states where the Secretary of State does the other Secretary of State stuff, like corporate filings and like, but literally just plays no role in elections. And they yet still sent the letter to the Democratic Secretary of State of Wisconsin.
They're clearly not doing their homework at all. Yeah. So we get this letter, and and then the third school of thought is, well, they must have a good reason. Let's, do our best to understand what they're looking for. And, for some states, the voter file is public information. And so secretaries are leading them to publicly available information. But these are not normal times. And I think that presumption of is it regularity needs to be thrown out the window. I was reading your column. I really do think these are not normal times. This is not a normal request. We can't treat it as an ordinary information request, because that's not what it is. And back to your original point, it's right there in the Constitution, Article 1. The states, not the federal government, are in charge of our elections.
Yeah, and I'm struck by something you said that maybe you can amplify on a little bit. I mean, historically, it is Republicans who have insisted that the federal government stay out of their business generally, but particularly around elections. I mean, years ago, I tried to work in a bipartisan effort to have states adopt what at that point we called voter registration modernization, which is essentially some combination of automatic voter registration or same-day voter registration. It was essentially to make the job of secretaries of states and election officials easier by having there be, sort of more automated processes and data sharing between states. And the people who were mainly against it at that time were Republicans, because they said, basically, we don't want the federal government. We don't want there to be a national ID. We don't want there to be a national database of everyone. The federal government would get their hands on this. Like, they were like the privacy advocates, basically saying the states keep this data and not you. And I don't think that they've changed their position ideologically, because if Joe Biden, like if Merrick Garland, forget about Joe Biden, if Merrick Garland is about as non-political as you can get, had sought this information, they would have said, go pound sand.
Exactly. I used to be head of the ACLU, and I worked in Washington on reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act when it was a bipartisan effort. And when I was running the ACLU of Maine, when Congress passed the Real ID, and I partnered with groups like Gun Owners of America and the librarians and other pro-privacy advocates to say no. And to your point, the Republicans were as fierce about trying to stop the Real ID, a national identity card, trying to protect privacy, sometimes more so than Democrats. And that seems to have flipped on its head just because of where it's coming from. But again, should there be a national voter registration file? I don't think so. And if Congress wanted to do that, they could have authorized it in legislation, but they haven't. So it really is chilling.
And quite intentionally. Last question on this. Do you have any sense? A few things about this kind of got me worried. One is just the times we're living in, the Trump administration, the politicization of the Department of Justice, all of that. But the second is something that you mentioned, which is that some of these contacts, I'll call them, are coming from the criminal division. And the criminal division really doesn't have a role here unless they're investigating specific crimes, at which point you wouldn't need the entire voter file. They'd be like, hey, Secretary, can you send us the voter information on this voter? Right? Like, which I assume would be a different set of calculations. You might provide it, you might not, but it would be a different kind of request. Do you have any idea what or theory as to what it is they are doing and why they are doing it?
I don't. And I want to go back to something you said earlier. You were involved in trying to modernize our elections, right? automatic voter registration. Now, I also run the Bureau of Motor Vehicles in Maine.
Yep.
And so one of the first things I did as secretary was implement automatic voter registration at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. So when people move to Maine, and everybody should, it's the way life should be, vacation land.
Especially this time of year. Especially this time of year.
Exactly. Or when kids get their license, their driver license for the first time, they can register to vote at the BMV. And you know what the side benefit of that was? My clerks, my local clerks, who are not a particularly progressive bunch necessarily, they love it. Why?
Yeah.
Because when people move, they don't remember to call their election clerk and say, hey, can you take me off the voter rolls? I'm moving to the town next door, or I'm moving to the state next door. But they do go to the Bureau of Motor
Right.
Vehicles. We call it the BMV. I know other states call it the DMV, and they get their license updated or their car registered. And that has been a just such a gold mine of cleaning up our voter rolls, because people are moving. And guess what happens? They register to vote, and we have that automatic data to take down their prior registration. It's been really great for cleaning up the voter rolls. So if the Department of Justice is concerned about the integrity of the voter rolls, they should be looking at modernization. Similarly, online voter registration, which I as secretary implemented last year in 2024, hugely popular with students, particularly on campuses. Guess who moves every year? Students on campuses. And so again, we saw that same effect, where suddenly we were seeing some cleaning and list maintenance of our voter rolls, because suddenly we had good data about where they were, and it was in our system.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Go ahead.
No, I actually wanted to talk to you about online voter registration, because I was going to highlight this is something you did in Maine. And I assume that there's like multiple benefits here. Obviously, people can register to vote. People, which is a good unto itself. It is easier to administer. But it always strikes me when I see states going in the other direction. Like, do they not live in a world in which people do everything online? Like it just strikes me that like the fact that you have to be a pioneer in this, I'm thinking like, how do they live their lives? Do they not have smartphones? Like it's not like, I know you say it's students and young people, but like honestly, if I had to go register to vote, I'd go find a website too.
Right. No, 100%. And, I bring these things up because the best interpretation is that they're genuinely concerned about voter list maintenance, and they want to have the voter list be as clean as possible. And that's why they're doing these inquiries. Now, I'm skeptical that that's their sole motivation, especially when you start talking about bringing in the criminal division, but that's the best possible explanation. And if that's true, then they should be interested in working with states that don't have online voter registration or automatic voter registration at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, and seeing states implement that. So then you go into the darker motivations. Why would they want a national voter file? Are they on a fishing expedition? Is this a witch hunt to try to find every single potential problem? And guess what? There are duplicates on the voter rolls because people don't tell their clerks when they move, not duplicate voters, but duplicate registrants. Sometimes there may be, I'm sure there are, in some isolated instances, some non-citizens may be on the rolls, and that's what election officials do every day is verify the integrity of the voter rolls. So are they looking for that one or two or three cases to try to impinge and just attack the integrity of our elections? Are they trying to create a pretext for more federal involvement in our elections? Are they trying to take down secretaries of state that they don't like? Or is it a combination of things? Also, are they dreaming of a day where they can look at who they're investigating for IRS fraud or the Epstein files and saying, okay, that person's a Democrat, we're going to go after them. That person's a Republican, we're not going to investigate them. There's this sort of litany of horribles, but regardless of what their motivations are, the principle remains the same. The federal government is not in charge of elections, and there is no reason why they should have your sensitive personal information.
Yeah. So I will tell you my concern. I won't say it's a theory because I don't know, like you. And I'm not going to spread, a conspiracy theory, but my concern is that, Donald Trump has a history of election denialism. He has promoted a movement of election deniers. And he, after the 2020 election, tried to get the federal government, the Department of Justice, to essentially cast doubt and to potentially overturn or seek an overturning of the election in Georgia through, like I said, through the Department of Justice. That was ultimately blocked by people in the Department of Justice. But if you were trying to spread disinformation and misinformation about election results, or you were trying to cast doubt on the validity of election results, having the voter file is like a data-rich environment with which to do that. And so that is my concern for you and for all the people who have to run elections in this country as we go forward towards 2026. And so towards that end, I have to ask you, how has your job gotten harder, if at all, by the kind of lies and conspiracy theories? Like, does it show up in the election workers, people not willing to work, the voter, how has it gotten, how is it to administer elections now in a state that is honestly a swing state? It has a swing congressional district. It'll have a very competitive Senate race. It may have a competitive governor's race. I know you're a candidate for that. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but how has this manifested to you?
So this is what I think is so troubling, right? Is that it's really scary for election workers, right? When people spread lies about the elections, when they argue that the 2020 election, we saw it in 2021, when Trump was saying the 2020 election was stolen, people believed him, and then they took it out on the people they held most responsible, and those were their local clerks.
Huh.
And that, I think, is just so sad. And so we saw threats in Maine for the first time. And I remember talking to one of our veteran clerks. She's been around for a couple of decades. And she said, it used to be people would bring me pies. Elections were like homecoming, lots of hugs. And she said, and now I get scared. We're doing scenario planning in 2024. We had multiple locations in Maine get swatted for the first time. Now, fortunately, we had done emergency preparedness training with law enforcement and our clerks. Voting was uninterrupted because they realized it was a hoax. But that's really scary. And so it does lead good people to retiring early and other people to reconsider whether it's worth doing the work, because election officials aren't getting paid well. They do it because they love our democracy. They love our country. And so, and for me personally, I didn't, when I ran for secretary, I didn't envision that I would be targeted, that my husband and I would have to live in a safe house for over a week while law enforcement investigated the threats that were coming in against us. I didn't envision that my home would be swatted. And yet now it's sort of like the cost of doing business, right? A cost of serving. And it shouldn't be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. So I do think the lies need to stop. And I'm very concerned about the bully pulpit of the presidency and DOJ with the voter file. And I just want to flag for your listeners that it feels like a concerted effort, because in June, the Maine GOP targeted us. They alleged that 51 Mainers had voted twice in 2024.
Huh.
And they released names to the press. So the press comes over to my office because the GOP, did a press availability. So they rush over to my office and they show me the list and they say, look, here's this. I'm not going to name her town or her exact age because it's me. It's like one small town. Everybody would know who it was. But they were like, here's this woman in Piscataquis County in her 90s who voted twice. Well, we looked her up in a heartbeat. And guess what? They were wrong. In Maine, you have municipal elections and state and federal elections, and she had voted both ballots. So they had interpreted her voting in a municipal election and in the state and federal election as voting twice. It's just one example. We looked at all 51 names, and they were wrong. Now, they had the voter file because the parties have the campaign use file that they can use for get out the vote. They don't have all the same personal information. They don't have social security numbers. They don't have full birthdays. But they said this. They released 51 names to the press. And thankfully, we have a very responsible media in Maine. Thankfully, they didn't show up on this woman's doorstep asking her why she voted twice, because she would have had a heart attack. And it's just ugly. So when I said when I released the results of our investigation that zero of the people that they had named had voted twice, then they were like, they were like, they did this silly press thing where they alleged that they were right, and so then the press was like, Secretary Bellows says that there were no one that voted twice. GOP says people voted twice. And it's like, there are facts.
I know.
But
I
guess
know.
what? If you're saying people voted twice in these small towns, who are the like people who have violent tendencies going to hold accountable? It's the clerks. And that's
Yeah.
really scary.
Yeah. So I just want to put an exclamation point on a fact that you gave along the way in that really important answer. The political parties in a lot of states, including in Maine, get a copy of the voter file, but it does not include some of this very personal information. I assume what the Department of Justice wants is the version with that personal information.
They wanted all of it.
Yeah. So
they wanted all of it.
So when the secretary,
yeah, keep going.
So when the secretary says that they wanted your information, they wanted your name, your address, your social security number, your date of birth, full date of birth. Like, that's what they were looking for. That's what they thought.
And you might say, well, the Social Security Administration already has my social security number and my date of birth. Well, they don't have your party affiliation.
Right.
And the Social Security Administration doesn't have the power to investigate you for tax fraud and put you in jail or whatever it might be. And so for DOJ, and also this idea that the criminal division and the civil division might be working together in concert, I don't know. You have more experience with the DOJ than I do. I mean, my background
that is not usually the way it works.
Yeah. And right. The DOJ actually, to their credit, prosecuted the guy that swatted me. They identified him. They put him in jail. They prosecuted him. And I have nothing but positive things to say about the criminal division. That was a crime. And it was a crime against other election officials too. So it's not that DOJ doesn't have a role to play when crimes occur. Right. Yeah. And you know what? If someone voted twice in 2024, they should be investigated and prosecuted and held accountable to the fullest extent of our law, because all of us who care about democracy, we want everyone who's eligible to be able to register, cast their vote, and know their vote counts. And that means absolutely ensuring that no one is voting illegally.
I totally agree. Totally agree.
That's their role.
But you don't need every Mainer's information, right? Like if you got those people, get their information.
Right. And again, going back to the Constitution, we don't treat every American as guilty until proven innocent. We identify, it's going back to those core principles. So that's what's so alarming and upsetting. And there's so much going on in the news. We're in the attention economy, right? It's hard to get people's attention, but people should be paying attention to this because it's very dangerous precedent. The president and his DOJ, they want to be in charge of federal elections. Why do they want to be in charge of federal elections? Because they have strong feelings about who wins and who loses.
That's right.
And this precedent of them having access to all of this data and taking on this role is yet another step in undermining democracy itself.
I'll be right back with more of my conversation with Secretary Bellows in a moment. But, in 2020, I started Democracy Docket to put a spotlight on the attacks that Republicans are launching against voting rights, free and fair elections, and democracy. Well, 5 years later, that spotlight is more important than ever. Donald Trump and the Republicans every day are trying to erode and undermine our democracy and our elections. The Democracy Docket team tracks all the anti-democratic groups working to undermine those elections and undermine your right to vote. They are watching voter suppression tactics, what Republicans are trying to do in Texas redistricting and around the country, and so much more. But in order to keep up this important fight, the Democracy Docket team needs to keep growing. And to do that, it needs your help. Support their work by becoming a premium member now at the link above or in the description below. Now, you had a big win in the state of Maine. A group of conservative. I assume they're Republicans. You probably know the backstory of who these people are. Have insisted on trying to promote voter ID in the state. They ran a campaign to get it on the ballot. You put together what has to be the most ingenious description of effects. I don't know what the term you use in Maine is, whether you call it description of effects or something else to describe it. And they got very unhappy with you. They sued. They lost. My law firm was involved in defending your action, although not representing you, representing other affected parties. Tell us about what they were up to and what you did.
So for everyone out there, you need to pay attention both to what's happening federally and again, Mark, thank you for your work. Anyone who cares about democracy is grateful for what you're doing today. It's huge. And you have to pay attention to what's happening at the local level and in your state. So in Maine, a group of activists with what they call the dinner table pack, they're led by a woman most notable for targeting a teenager who is transgender and really just a woman who's really, she's anyway, we'll stop there. They brought a proposal for a voter ID. Now, I don't think you should be required to show a voter ID when you go to vote. In Maine, we require it at the point of registration, not at the point of voting. But reasonable people can agree to disagree on voter ID. Let's just put that there. So the process is they bring us a proposal. We send it to the Office of the Revisers. They write up the statute and send it back. And they have one chance to update their language. So they came back and they said, we don't want to do just voter ID. We want to make all of these changes to Maine elections. And there are about 26 changes to Maine election laws. And so they have the right to do that. So they send it back to us. We prepare the petitions. They went out, they had to gather just about 60,000 signatures. It's 10% of the turnout of the most recent gubernatorial election. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Maine was number one in 2022 in voter participation in the nation. In 2024, Minnesota beat us out.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a contest between you all, which is why I know you have Steve Simon. You know, when you praised Steve Simon as Secretary of State of Maine earlier, I was like, she's definitely got him on mine, because this is always the big battle between the two states.
It's the rivalry, Minnesota and Maine. So they got the signatures. I certified the question, but as secretary in Maine, I get to write the referendum questions if they come from the citizens. So, and then I put it out to public comment, and folks can comment, and then if they don't like it, they can sue. So, Maine's question, I'm going to read it because it's the most concise way to describe it. Do you want to change Maine election laws to eliminate 2 days of absentee voting, prohibit requests for absentee ballots by phone or family members, and ongoing absentee voter status for seniors and people with disabilities, ban prepaid postage on absentee ballot return envelopes, limit the number of drop boxes, require voters to show certain photo ID before voting, and make other changes to our elections? That's the question. Why did I write it that way? Because that's what it does. That is what the law does. And so they sued because they thought it was biased. They wanted the voter ID part to be first. They were hoping people wouldn't read the rest of it. And they objected to me mentioning that Maine currently has this great program where if seniors or people with disabilities want to get their ballot mailed to them, they can automatically. It's ongoing. They wanted those words excised from the question. And the Maine Supreme Court ruled that the question was fair, it wasn't biased, and that I was in my full authority. So that's on our ballot. It'll be the first question on the ballot, question 1 in Maine in November. And those stakes are high because imagine, this is also a struggle across the country. It seems like some politicians seem to want to pick their voters. They want only people, they kind of want to take us back to the founders of like white property males voting in our elections, right? They don't want people to be able to vote early, whether it's absentee voting or in person. We have 30 days of no excuse. You can vote in person or vote absentee by mail in Maine, in addition to same day voter registration. So they want to get rid of those things and make it harder for people to vote. They don't want Maine to be number one in the nation. In fact, can I share one more thing? The
Yeah,
Department of
please.
Justice wanted
I
the
love
Department.
stories of fighters. You're a fighter, and I love stories of elected officials, Democratic elected officials, standing up for voters, standing up for democracy. And so keep going, keep going.
So the Department of Justice, in their letter, in addition to asking for the voter file and all this garbage, they wanted to know why our voter registration rate was so high. Secretary Bellows, why is your voter registration rate 92%? Well, because I do a lot of voter registration, right? Like I go onto campuses, I go everywhere in the community I can. I talk to all sorts of groups. We're proud of 92% of our citizen voting age population being registered to vote. We don't think that's a problem.
Okay, so you mentioned that before you were Secretary of State, you worked at the ACLU, both nationally, and you ran it in the state of Maine. I would be remiss if I did not use this opportunity, since we are in the week of the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. Its passage in 1965. And, here we are facing, again, an existential threat at the Supreme Court, case out of Alabama that they'll hear. You see Republicans voting against reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act, expanding the Voting Rights Act. Every Republican in Congress voted against it when it came up a couple of Congresses ago. And you mentioned that this was not always the case, that this used to be a bipartisan bill. So talk a little bit, since I know you have a connection to that, talk a little bit about, kind of, what it means to you, what it means to the work that you have frankly dedicated your life to, that we are in this place where one major party is now systematically trying to gut the crown jewel of American democracy.
Yeah. So when I was a kid, we were really poor. Dad was a carpenter. I grew up without electricity or running water until I was in the 5th grade. And I had a copy of the Bill of Rights on my bedroom wall. I was a democracy geek even back then. And I loved this idea of opportunity and of voting and democracy I just loved the idea of we the people and those rights. And so my dream job was to go work for the National ACLU. I was a field organizer in Washington, D.C. from 2003 to 2005 before I moved home to Maine to run the ACLU of Maine. And we were working on Voting Rights Act reauthorization. So we were organizing our members to come to Washington, meet with their members of Congress, talk about the importance of voting rights. And what was remarkable back then, as we were preparing for the Voting Rights Act reauthorization, is we ended up getting the support of the Republicans, and this was the Voting Rights Act before it became a ghost of its former self, before Shelby County versus Holder, before the Voting Rights Act was eviscerated by a right-wing Supreme Court not interested in the rule of law, and signed the reauthorization. The president, George W. Bush, whom I did not support, but yet
you and me both,
supporting the Voting Rights Act reauthorization. And, when I went home to run the ACLU of Maine, we had Trump before Trump was Trump. We had Governor Paul LePage, and he took control of the State House in 2000. He had elected in 2010. Republicans gained the State House. They repealed same-day voter registration that year. We had it in Maine since Republicans had passed it in 1972 in Maine.
Oh my Lord!
Right, we'd had it uninterrupted.
You must have been one of the first states to have it.
We were, and the reason we're not MVRA exempt is a whole nother conversation for another time. But we were, and so I co-chaired the campaign to get it back, and we had a referendum campaign. We got it back. And it continued. But it just makes me so sad, because in that campaign, we had a lot of Republican support. We had a lot of folks out front on voting too. And I just think right now, the Voting Rights Act has been completely gutted by the Supreme Court, but it is still really important, right? We still need to at least stand strong against racial discrimination in our in redistricting and in voting. So but how we got here, I think, is too many people not standing up for principle, standing up for their own career, their own political interests, sort of, and trying to choose their electorates.
Yeah.
So,
I always remind people that one of the reasons why, people always remember past 98-0 in the Senate, uh, that year in 2006. But I always remind them that one of the reasons it passed 98-0 is because the business community made it a priority.
mm,
Like literally the business roundtable chaired by the CEO of Walmart said this is one of our priority pieces of legislation. And just to watch now the cowardice among the business community, the cowardice among large institutions and corporations, law firms, universities, I mean, we could go on and on. At this time with Donald Trump, it is really disconcerting, because the truth is, if corporate America wanted the Voting Rights Act to be reauthorized, they could put pressure on the Republicans the way they did in 2006, and they aren't. And so, that is, I think, one of the shameful facts of this era in time. Now, you also, I said publicly at the time, I'm on video. People can go find the videos. I wrote about it. I thought you got it exactly right in 2023 when you ruled that Donald Trump was ineligible to be on the ballot in Maine. I think the Supreme Court's decision there was completely wrongheaded and wrong. And I think that your position was factually correct, legally correct, and also courageous to take. I mean, people who are watching this video need to know, Maine, like I said, it is a purple state, and when you have a Secretary of State who is willing to do the right thing, and stand up to Donald Trump, that's going to cost her support among a whole lot of folks in parts of Maine that are big supporters of Donald Trump. So I wanted to like give you kudos and praise for your courage for doing the right thing, even in the face of what was probably a lot of hostility among the electorate or parts of the electorate, and also, ultimately a hostile court. But I want to frame the question to you this way. Here we are 6 months in, and I think that a lot of people who thought, oh, why are people like Secretary Bellows saying everything's going to be terrible and Donald Trump's a threat and this will all, this is a threat to democracy. When you reflect back on the last 6 months, do you feel like you're vindicated? Do you feel like sadness? Do you feel like anger? Like you obviously understood this threat at a much more sort of granular and visceral level and a legal, I think you were right on the law. And I feel like a lot of people who at the time were like, let's go slow, let's be cautious. Like now they're like, house is on fire. Do you sometimes like, I told you so?
I think it's not I told you so, although I still think I was right and the Supreme Court was
Yeah,
wrong.
you are.
I still think Donald Trump engaged in insurrection on January 6th. And
there's like video of it. Like this is the thing, like it was like literally done on TV.
And so I do feel sadness, and anger at what's happening, at the dismantling of our democracy and so much that we hold dear, and at the suffering that's already happening all across this country. So I feel deep sadness and anger, but most of all, I feel resolve, because what you talked about with corporate America, with the law firms, with the banks, with the universities, what's happening with politicians, fear is contagious, right? It takes hold, and people are more worried about their own power, their own position, their own selves than they are about this amazing, you know, imperfect, but the values that we share, right? And the principles that we hold most dear. And so, what else is contagious is courage. Mm-hmm. And I think that is what is called for in this moment, is courage. And I do think courage is contagious. And there's a country song that most people are good. And I'm not sure anymore if most people are good, but most people in Maine are good. And no, I'm teasing. I do think we need to appeal to people's better natures. We need to show courage, and we need to find ways to fight back. And maybe some of the institutions that are being dismantled, the systems that are crumbling, were broken. And so maybe it's time to envision a different way. Like, what does it look like in the future? But voting and our elections, those are systems that are working. And so how do we improve that? How do we, go from 92% voter registration in Maine to 100% voter registration in Maine? That's my goal. But we have to do it now. We can't wait, because the longer we wait, and you're not waiting, you're fighting back every day with every breath in your body. But the longer that people sit on the sidelines, the more damage is done.
That's right.
So that is really the call to action, is wherever it is that you have influence, that you have any power, to start speaking up, to start showing that courage, because the moment is now. The moment to protect our democracy in 2026 and 2028, that starts yesterday, but it's not too late. We have to get engaged, and we need to start fighting back.
All right. I got to ask you one final question or two here, which is that probably the single biggest question I get is about the 2026 elections. People are worried, that that there won't be elections. I tell people there will be elections, even dictators like elections. They worry about whether there'll be free and fair elections. I tell them that's a legitimate concern. They worry about the Department of Justice. You are the Secretary of State. You're also, by the way, running for governor, so you'll be like on the ballot, so to speak, and you also have other very competitive races in that state. There'll be almost certainly a competitive Senate race. Probably, there are competitive congressional races in the state. So, what do you think about the 2026 elections, and what should Mainers, what should people around the country think about? What should they worry about, and what should they do about it?
I love this question, and I get asked a lot too.
I'm sure you get asked it more than even I get asked it.
And a Vietnam veteran whom I really respect recently asked me, and he was teary about it. And I said yes. And here is why I think there will be elections in 2026. In addition to your point that the question is the quality of the elections, right? Because even dictators like elections. But the reason I think there will be real elections is because Article 1 of the Constitution reserves the power of elections to the states. They're incredibly decentralized. And as I've worked across the country, I chair a national election security and cybersecurity. I did chair a national election security and cybersecurity group in 2024 with Republicans and Democrats working on it. I think the checks and balances that exist in terms of election administration across the nation, and the quality of your county clerks, your local clerks, people at every level, and the fact that 90-something% of the ballots in this country are paper ballots. So it is
also a piece of disinformation that the right wing, they're always like, we need paper ballots. I'm like, don't you guys vote? Like most places overwhelmingly use paper ballots.
Yes. And that is the ultimate safeguard, right? That's the gold standard in election security. So I think it is very difficult to steal a national election or to stop the election from happening. But what can you do about it, to just not hope, and don't take my word for it, is get involved. Get involved as a volunteer. There are municipal elections this year. There are elections in some states, like in my state, with a referendum election. So, reach out to your county clerk or your municipal clerk and ask if they need some volunteer help. I bet they do. Maybe they just need pie. But whatever you can do to get involved in supporting election administrators and supporting that election infrastructure, and then also advocating in legislatures for election resources for the next budget cycle, so that election administrators have the resources they need to do everything that they need to do. And I think also don't share disinformation, right? Because in the same way, that fear is contagious. If we fall into despair, if we give up, if we share rumors or disinformation that's not real, then we might inadvertently engage in voter suppression, right? Because people might give up. They might think it doesn't matter. And it still matters. It absolutely matters.
Yeah, I say this all the time. Donald Trump wants you to have despair. Donald Trump wants you to believe that there is nothing you can do to stop him from being a dictator. He wants you to think elections don't matter. He wants you to think the courts don't matter. He wants you to believe that it's all futile, because then you'll stop fighting. And so you need to listen to what the secretary is saying, because she is fighting every single day. And what she's saying is you need to as well. It doesn't mean we're unrealistic about the challenges in front of us. You don't, she's very realistic here about what we're facing. But you can be both realistic, but also insist that we hold free and fair elections, insist that our government operate on the merits, insist that the courts do their jobs. And so if we do those things, we'll hopefully make it through the other side of this. The other thing I just wanted to say in closing, it is rare that I get someone to come on this podcast who has a genuine accomplishment. I mean, Maine, highest voter registration in the country. I think you said 92%, right?
92%. I don't know if we're number one. We were number one in 2022.
Okay, well, let's put it this way: 92%, pretty damn good. It is rare to get someone to come on podcasts where they have something they can genuinely boast about. 92% voter registration, an incredible number. And yet, what did you hear her say? What you heard her say is we're trying to get to 100%. Now, that's the kind of fighting we need. That's the kind of people we need every day fighting for democracy. Because even when she is succeeding beyond what most people think is possible, she's still saying, I want to do more. And I still want to get, I'm not resting on what we've done, but more that we can do. Secretary Bellows, thank you for everything you've done in the fight for democracy. And thank you for joining me today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Defending Democracy. Please make sure you're subscribed to Democracy Docket's free newsletters to stay informed on the latest voting rights and democracy news.